Tonight, the first topic we explore is the life and ideas of Nikola Tesla, the enigmatic inventor whose brilliance once lit up the world and whose name, today, whispers through the wires of modern innovation. From harnessing the raw power of electricity to envisioning wireless communication long before it was possible, Tesla's imagination soared beyond the constraints of his time. But behind the genius was a man, lonely, eccentric, and tragically misunderstood. So before you get comfortable, as always, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, only if you enjoy our content. And let us know, where are you watching from and what time is it for you? Sometimes our stories are too interesting, and we're working on some boring ones. It's time now to dim the lights. Turn on a fan for some soft background noise, and let's cover what we have for tonight, together. Nikola Tesla entered the world on a night that seemed torn between heaven and earth. It was July 10th, 1856, and a thunderstorm raged over the small mountain village of Smiljan, nestled in what was then the Austrian Empire, modern-day Croatia. As the wind howled and lightning split the sky, Tesla's mother labored by candlelight. A midwife, unnerved by the storm, whispered that this was a bad omen. But his mother, Duca Tesla, simply smiled and replied, "No, he will be a child of light." That single phrase would come to define him. Nikola's parents were opposites in many ways. His father, Milutin, was a stern Serbian Orthodox priest, a man of letters and logic. He wanted his son to follow a path of religion and language. His mother, by contrast, had no formal education, but she possessed a rare mechanical genius. She built household tools from scratch, invented devices to ease daily chores, and could recite entire epic poems from memory. Tesla would later credit her as the true source of his inventive mind. From a young age, Nikola stood apart. His memory was photographic. He could read a book once and quote it line by line. His imagination was boundless, so vivid that images would appear before his eyes like waking dreams. He began to see flashes of light and experience hallucinations. At times, the line between his mind and the outside world seemed to blur. He would later describe these moments not as madness, but as a gift, an ability to visualize entire machines with precision, down to the bolts and spinning gears, before ever lifting a tool. He was also deeply sensitive to patterns, sounds, and numbers. Tesla had peculiar habits that would follow him his entire life. He avoided touching hair, couldn't bear the sight of pearls, and was obsessed with the number 3. If he entered a building, he would walk around it 3 times. These weren't just quirks. They were part of a mind finely attuned to the rhythm of the universe. Though few understood him, the young boy from Smiljan was already dreaming of forces no one else could see. Currents that moved through the earth and sky, waiting to be harnessed. The world had no idea what had just been born into its storm, but the future would soon feel the charge. As Nikola Tesla grew, so did the scope of his dreams. While other children played with toys or ran in fields, Tesla wandered through the world with questions. Why did birds migrate without sight? What made the stars shimmer? Could energy be drawn from the earth itself? He didn't just want answers. He wanted to feel the very pulse behind reality. He pursued education with relentless hunger. After completing primary school in Karlovac, Tesla enrolled in the Austrian Polytechnic School in Graz. It was there, surrounded by the ticking of gears and the buzz of generators, that his true vision began to form. In one lecture, he witnessed a demonstration of a direct current, DC motor. It sparked in his mind a quiet rebellion. DC, the dominant electrical system of the time, felt inefficient to him, limited, crude. Tesla imagined something better. He envisioned a world powered by alternating current, AC, a system where energy flowed back and forth in waves, efficient and powerful, capable of traveling great distances with minimal loss. To his professors, the idea seemed absurd, but Tesla didn't argue. He simply stored the vision deep in his mind, where it grew, refined, and evolved like a living machine waiting to be born. His studies, though brilliant, were interrupted. A mixture of illness, overwork, and financial difficulty forced him to leave Graz before graduation. He would later study in Prague, but never formally receive a degree. Still, Tesla was undeterred. Knowledge, to him, wasn't something granted. It was something pursued like a current in the air, invisible, yet everywhere. He spent long nights walking through forests, solving equations in his head. He could see turbines spinning in waterfalls, towers drawing power from lightning, devices floating information through the air. Long before the world imagined such things, Tesla could already feel them humming quietly in his mind. But genius, especially when unshaped by the world's rules, often goes unrecognized. His ideas were too strange, too far ahead of their time. Though he would go on to invent technologies that would shape the modern world, his early visions were mostly met with skepticism or silence. Still, Tesla walked on, guided not by approval, but by something deeper, a vision of the future no one else could yet see, a world not of wires and smoke, but of resonance, vibration, and light. In 1884, Nikola Tesla stepped off the boat in New York City with 4 cents in his pocket, a head full of inventions, and a letter of recommendation addressed to one man, Thomas Edison. The city was alive with chaos, bustling streets, the clang of iron, and the newborn hum of electric lights. Edison was the king of that world. Known as the Wizard of Menlo Park, he had already achieved legendary status as the inventor of the phonograph and the electric light bulb. His company, Edison Machine Works, was expanding rapidly, and Tesla was eager to join. The letter Tesla carried described him as a genius. Edison hired him immediately. At first, Tesla admired Edison's relentless work ethic. Both men were tireless. Both lived on little sleep. But that's where the similarities ended. Edison believed in trial and error, building and breaking until something worked. Tesla, by contrast, built his machines in the mind first, turning them in his imagination, solving every problem before touching a single tool. Tesla proposed a redesign of Edison's direct current, DC electrical systems, an upgrade that would save time, energy, and money. According to Tesla, Edison laughed. Some say he promised $50,000 if Tesla could make his system more efficient. When Tesla did, Edison allegedly waved it off as a joke. "I don't understand American humor," Tesla said coldly. Disillusioned, Tesla left Edison's company. It was a turning point, both liberating and painful. He was jobless, penniless, and wandering the streets of Manhattan. For a time, he dug ditches to survive, his hands in the dirt while his mind remained in the clouds, sketching systems of wireless energy and spinning magnetic fields. Though their rivalry would become legendary, Tesla never truly hated Edison. He once described him as a hard-working man who lacked imagination. Edison, in turn, never grasped the depth of Tesla's vision, nor did he seem to care. But what Tesla did next would ignite a revolution that Edison couldn't stop. Out of rejection came resolve. Tesla was more determined than ever to bring his alternating current system to life. And in doing so, he would challenge the most powerful inventor of his era, not with money nor influence, but with light, logic, and the quiet fury of a dreamer scorned. For, after leaving Edison behind, Nikola Tesla was still a man with a vision, but no means. He spent a year laboring beneath the city he longed to electrify, digging trenches for underground wiring. But even in those dim, gritty days, Tesla's mind never stopped spinning, and soon fate would shift. In 1887, Tesla found backers who believed in his ideas. He established his own laboratory in Manhattan and began building his alternating current, AC motors. Unlike Edison's direct current, Tesla's system used magnetic fields and rotating currents, able to transmit power efficiently over vast distances. It was elegant, powerful, scalable. Word of Tesla's breakthrough reached George Westinghouse, an industrialist and inventor who had already begun advocating for AC power. He saw in Tesla the missing piece to revolutionize electricity. In 1888, Westinghouse licensed Tesla's patents, offering funding, resources, and, for the first time, recognition. But with progress came conflict. Edison, fearing the collapse of his DC empire, launched a campaign against AC. It wasn't just business. It was a war of ideas, and Edison was prepared to fight dirty. He began a public smear effort, staging gruesome demonstrations that showed animals being electrocuted with AC current, calling it dangerous and deadly. He even backed the invention of the electric chair using AC power, branding it as the execution current. Despite the theatrics, Tesla remained calm. He trusted the science, and when the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago awarded its massive lighting contract to Westinghouse and Tesla, AC was given its moment. That fair was a turning point. Over 100,000 electric bulbs lit the night with brilliance never before seen. Crowds gasped as machines buzzed, danced, and whirred, all powered by Tesla's alternating current. It was more than a victory. It was a glimpse into the future. Shortly after, Tesla's system was chosen to harness the energy of Niagara Falls, the first large-scale hydroelectric plant in history. For the first time, a city, Buffalo, New York, was powered by water and current alone. Tesla had won the war of currents, not with showmanship, but with vision and elegant design. But the spotlight, as always, began to shift elsewhere. And while the world cheered, Tesla quietly turned his mind to the next great challenge. He had lit the Earth. Now, he wondered, could he do the same for the sky? With alternating current now humming through cities and across rivers, Nikola Tesla might have stopped there. He had changed the world, but Tesla was never interested in standing still. His mind lived far beyond the present. While others saw wires and profits, Tesla saw resonance, energy in the air, a planet humming with untapped power. He believed the Earth itself could be a conductor. That energy could be transmitted wirelessly, through the ground, through the sky, even across oceans. In the late 1890s, Tesla moved to Colorado Springs, a place with wide open skies and space enough for the strange experiments he dreamed of. He built a massive lab on the edge of town, crowned with a towering Tesla coil. And there, like a modern-day wizard, he began pulling lightning from the heavens. At night, locals could see great arcs of electricity leaping into the sky, lighting up the plains. Rumors spread. Was he controlling weather, summoning forces he didn't understand? Even the ground around the lab would spark and crackle. Tesla had accidentally set the town's electrical station on fire more than once. But he was undeterred. In his journals, he wrote of contacting other planets, perhaps even Mars. He claimed to receive mysterious signals, repeating patterns that hinted, he believed, at intelligent life. Most dismissed him. But Tesla didn't mind. He wasn't trying to convince anyone. He envisioned a global system of towers, broadcasting energy wirelessly, powering ships, lighting cities, and connecting voices across continents. Years before Marconi's radio or modern cell towers, Tesla was already imagining a wireless world. And yet, while Tesla dreamt of universal power, others were dreaming of something else: money. Investors wanted patents and control. They didn't understand or trust a system that couldn't be metered. Why fund a machine that would give energy away for free? In Colorado, Tesla's ideas crackled with possibility. His machines sang with resonance, his towers vibrated with dreams. But as always, he was working far ahead of his time, in a world that preferred wires, walls, and ownership. Tesla returned to New York, not with a final invention, but with a vision. A map of an unseen network, drawn in blue arcs and whispered frequencies. A future not yet built, but still waiting, patiently, in the silence between signals. When Nikola Tesla returned to New York from Colorado Springs, his mind was ablaze with a singular vision: to build the first true wireless power station, one that could transmit not just messages, but energy itself across the globe. With boldness in his eyes and blueprints in hand, Tesla approached one of the most powerful financiers in the world, J.P. Morgan. Tesla promised something extraordinary, a tower that could send wireless communication across the Atlantic, one that would connect continents and eventually provide free energy to the masses. Morgan agreed to fund it. In 1901, on the shores of Long Island's North Shore, the Wardenclyffe Tower began to rise. It stood 187 feet tall, with a deep shaft driven into the ground beneath to anchor the vibrations. At the time, it looked like the future, a giant metal spire, part cathedral, part lightning rod, crowned with a copper dome that hummed with possibility. But Tesla's intentions remained elusive. He spoke little of profits. He dreamed instead of a world where ships at sea could receive power from the air, where villages without wires could glow with light, where no one would ever pay for electricity again. When Morgan discovered that Tesla's true goal was to distribute energy freely, the support began to crumble. Morgan, ever the businessman, reportedly asked, "Where do I put the meter?" And when no meter could be found, the funding dried up. The world, too, was changing. Guglielmo Marconi, using Tesla's own patents, successfully sent the first transatlantic radio signal. The press hailed him. Tesla, by contrast, faded from headlines. He had once again been outmaneuvered, not by intelligence, but by pragmatism. Wardenclyffe Tower was never completed. The lab fell silent. The great transmitter stood unused for years, a monument to a dream that few understood. In 1917, it was dismantled for scrap, its towering frame sold for parts during wartime. Tesla watched his greatest project vanish into rust, but the idea behind it never died. Even as the tower fell, Tesla believed the world would one day come back to the concept, not for wealth, but for harmony. For a future where energy flows like wind, quiet and free, waiting only for someone brave enough to listen again to the silence between the sparks. By the 1920s, Nikola Tesla had become a ghost of the man who once lit the world's fairs and summoned lightning from the sky. His name was fading from the newspapers. His patents, once revolutionary, had been sold off, forgotten, or credited to others. And yet, in the heart of New York City, in a modest hotel room high above the streets, Tesla continued to dream. He moved frequently, often skipping rent, living alone in quiet, cluttered rooms. The world outside was entering the modern age. Cars rumbled down avenues, radios filled homes with music, and skyscrapers pierced the sky. Much of it was built on Tesla's ideas, but few remembered. Tesla had grown eccentric with age. He dressed immaculately in tailored suits and white gloves, even when he had no money to eat. He avoided shaking hands. He claimed numbers held a divine code, especially the number 3, which governed his daily rituals. If he touched a doorknob, he would do it 3 times. If he walked around a building, it had to be done 3 times. He wasn't just being strange. He was following patterns only he seemed able to see. His dearest companions were not people, but pigeons. He fed them daily in Bryant Park, speaking softly to them as if they were old friends. One particular white dove held his heart. He said she visited him regularly, always finding his window, and that he loved her as one would love another human being. When she grew ill, he cared for her personally. And when she died, Tesla claimed he saw a beam of light flash from her eyes, a sign, he believed, that his life's work was complete. Though newspapers occasionally interviewed him, often printing his stranger claims about death rays or Martian messages, few truly listened. To many, he was just an odd old man in a dusty room, speaking of impossible things. But inside Tesla's mind, the universe was still alive with vibration and frequency. Even as the world dismissed him, he remained tethered to the future, not by profit, not by fame, but by an endless desire to understand the unseen forces that connect us all. And so, high above Manhattan, in the dim flicker of a hotel lamp, the last quiet chapters of a forgotten genius began to write themselves, one dream at a time. The end came softly for Nikola Tesla. No crowds, no speeches, no fanfare, just silence. On January 7, 1943, in room 3327 of the New Yorker hotel, Tesla passed away alone. He was 86 years old. A maid found his lifeless body the next morning, lying peacefully in bed. The room was filled with papers, notebooks, small inventions, and the quiet hum of forgotten genius. He died with few possessions, and even fewer visitors. His debts had mounted. His name had slipped from memory. Yet the ideas he left behind, scattered in drawers, scribbled in the margins of books, hidden in stacks of blueprints, would echo far beyond that quiet hotel room. When news of his death reached the government, the FBI quickly moved in. Agents seized his documents, fearing they contained secrets too dangerous to leave unguarded. Rumors swirled. Had Tesla truly invented a death ray? Had he discovered limitless energy? The truth was tangled somewhere in his notes, some complete, some cryptic, some lost to time. Despite the obscurity of his final years, the world slowly began to remember. Later that same year, the Supreme Court invalidated Marconi's claim to the invention of radio, finally restoring Tesla's patent and giving him long overdue credit. It was a quiet correction, buried in legal text, but it mattered. The man who once whispered of wireless worlds had been right all along. Nikola Tesla was buried in a simple service, attended by a few loyal friends and admirers. There were no parades, no statues. But those who knew him, those who had once stood beside his towers or seen his mind in motion, understood the magnitude of what had been lost. He had lived not for riches, nor for applause, but for discovery, for the pursuit of the unknown, for the beauty hidden in patterns of light and sound. And though his final years were spent in solitude, Tesla had always said he was never truly alone. The universe was his companion, its vibrations, its frequencies, its endless mystery. He died quietly, yes, but somewhere, perhaps, in the background hum of the world he helped create, his energy still lingers, soft, brilliant, eternal. Nikola Tesla may have died in silence, but the world he helped shape has never stopped speaking his name. Today, his fingerprints are everywhere, in the buzzing power lines above us, the wireless signals that circle the globe, the machines that move without wires, and the technologies that hum quietly in our pockets. Alternating current, remote controls, radio waves, induction motors, neon lights, all owe a debt to his mind. He saw the Earth not just as rock and soil, but as a giant conductor, a vessel of energy waiting to be tapped, shared, and understood. He believed the future would be built not with wires, but with resonance, not with domination, but with harmony. Though others profited from his ideas, Tesla never chased wealth. He died poor, but never bitter. In his heart, he believed that ideas belonged to the world. That knowledge was a form of light. And even if the world was slow to catch up, he knew the current would eventually flow. Decades after his death, his legacy began to rise again. Scientists, engineers, and historians re-evaluated his work. Statues were erected, books were written, schools named after him. And in the 21st century, his name found new life, etched in electric cars, in energy labs, in the minds of those who look at the stars and wonder, what if? But perhaps the truest legacy of Nikola Tesla is not a single invention, or a tower, or a patent. It's the example he left us of a mind that dared to dream far beyond the limits of its time. Of a man who walked alone, not for lack of company, but because his path had never been walked before. Tesla taught us that the future belongs to the dreamers, that the quiet thinkers, the ones lost in thought while the world hurries by, often carry within them the sparks that will one day light the way for us all. So tonight, as you drift into sleep and the noise of the day fades away, remember this. Somewhere, between silence and electricity, between science and wonder, the spirit of Nikola Tesla still hums softly, timeless, invisible, and waiting to be heard. Long ago, on the shimmering edge of the Mediterranean Sea, a city rose from vision. Its name was Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great around 331 BCE. Though Alexander would die young and never see the city completed, his dream lingered in its marble streets and sea-swept harbours. After Alexander's death, one of his generals, Ptolemy the Sota, took control of Egypt. He made Alexandria his capital, and under his rule, the city blossomed. More than just a centre of trade or politics, it became something rare, a place devoted to learning. Ptolemy, influenced by Greek philosophy and the teachings of Aristotle, envisioned a home for all the world's knowledge, not just a collection of scrolls, but a sanctuary of wisdom, a place where the great questions of life, the cosmos, and human existence could be asked, quietly, patiently, without fear. Thus, the dream of the Library of Alexandria was born. It began not with stone walls or columns, but with an idea that knowledge should not be hoarded or hidden, but gathered and shared. The library would be part of a larger institution, the Mausion, a place dedicated to the muses, goddesses of inspiration and the arts. Together, they would become the heartbeat of Alexandria's intellect. The goal was simple, yet impossibly ambitious: to collect every book, every scroll, every fragment of thought in every language from every land. Agents were sent across the world to acquire manuscripts. Ships entering Alexandria's port were searched, and their books copied, sometimes kept. The city became a beacon, drawing scholars, poets, mathematicians, and philosophers from Greece, India, Mesopotamia, and beyond. No one knew how much knowledge the human mind could hold, but in Alexandria, they intended to find out. It's said that the first librarians walked through columns lined with papyrus scrolls, their sandals echoing in vaulted halls. They whispered in Greek, in Egyptian, in languages now lost to time. And in those moments, for the first time in history, humanity began to see itself not as scattered tribes or empires, but as a species capable of learning together. The Library of Alexandria did not begin as a building. It began as a flame that would burn, bright and fragile, at the heart of the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria was not built to house mere stories. It was built to collect the knowledge of the world, every insight, every theory, every poem and prophecy ever written. It was humanity's first attempt to hold, in one place, the sum of its own understanding. But how does one begin to gather the thoughts of an entire civilization? Under the Ptolemies, especially Ptolemy II, the collection effort became relentless. Agents and scholars were dispatched far and wide, to Athens, to Babylon, to Carthage and India. Wherever scrolls could be found, they were copied or acquired. Alexandria's docks became a gateway not just for goods, but for ideas. Ships that entered the harbour were required to surrender any books they carried. The originals were kept, copies returned to the owners. The ambition was clear. Nothing was too obscure or too sacred to be included. Estimates of the collection vary wildly. Some say the library held 40,000 scrolls. Others claim over 400,000. But the true number is less important than the spirit behind it. These weren't just shelves of paper. They were voices, scrolls of science, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, literature, politics, religion. Texts in Egyptian, Sanskrit, Persian, Hebrew, and dozens of other tongues. The library wasn't just Greek, it was global. Among its treasures were early texts on astronomy from Mesopotamia, mathematical principles from India, surgical techniques from Egypt, and philosophical dialogues from Athens. It's said the lost plays of Aeschylus were once kept there, along with ancient maps of the stars, and perhaps even older writings now lost to time. But the library was more than a warehouse of words. Every scroll was carefully copied, translated, and preserved by scribes and scholars. The library didn't just keep information, it refined it. Scholars engaged with these texts, challenged them, expanded upon them. Imagine a place where a student could read the Vedas, consult Aristotle, study Babylonian star charts, and then discuss it all over dinner with the finest minds of the age. That was Alexandria. Each scroll carried the echo of another time, another place, another mind. And within those walls, for a brief moment in history, humanity tried to listen to them all. It was not a collection. It was a conversation, centuries long, ever-growing, and breathtakingly alive. The Library of Alexandria was never just a building filled with scrolls. It was a living, breathing world of minds in motion. Attached to the library was the Mausion, a sanctuary dedicated to the Muses, the divine inspirations behind music, poetry, science, and learning. This was more than symbolic. The Mausion functioned much like a modern university or research institute. It provided housing, food, and stipends for scholars from across the known world. Here, thinkers were not burdened by survival. They were free to read, write, debate, and explore ideas without limit. They lived within the grounds, among gardens, lecture halls, laboratories, and observatories. It was a quiet place, but not a silent one. The halls were filled with the gentle rustle of scrolls, the scratch of pens on parchment, and the soft murmur of conversation, Greek, Egyptian, Aramaic, and others blending into a symphony of thought. The scholars who walked these halls were some of the greatest minds in history. Euclid, the father of geometry, laid the foundation of mathematical reasoning that still guides classrooms today. Eratosthenes, the head librarian, used shadows and sticks to calculate the circumference of the Earth, coming remarkably close to the actual number. Herophilos dissected human bodies, mapping the nervous system and describing the brain as the seat of thought, centuries before such ideas became accepted. And Aristarchus of Samos proposed a heliocentric model of the universe, suggesting that the Earth revolved around the Sun, an idea the world would not embrace until long after his death. Within the library and Mausion, there were no strict lines between disciplines. Philosophy blended with science, mathematics inspired poetry, medicine drew upon astronomy. Knowledge was not divided, it was interconnected, like the stars above or the roots of a tree. This environment created something rare, not just the preservation of knowledge, but the acceleration of it. Here, questions were not feared, they were welcomed. Truth was not declared, it was pursued, and wisdom was not owned, it was shared. In these marble chambers and vine-covered courtyards, the human mind was allowed to stretch, to wander, to wonder. And for a little while, in the bright heart of Alexandria, the world seemed to remember what it meant to seek truth without fear. For years, the Library of Alexandria stood as a symbol of light in a world still shadowed by ignorance. But no light, however bright, is immune to the winds of politics and war. In 48 BCE, the city of Alexandria found itself caught in conflict. Julius Caesar, drawn into a dynastic struggle between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy the Themed, arrived with Roman legions to settle the chaos. When hostilities erupted near the harbour, Caesar, under siege, ordered the docks set ablaze to prevent enemy ships from surrounding him. What happened next is a matter of debate, but the flames leapt from the wooden piers to nearby buildings, and some accounts suggest that the fire spread to warehouses storing scrolls from the library. If true, it may have been one of the first devastating blows to the library's vast collection. Was it the main library that burned? Or simply an annex, a storage facility along the harbour? Historians cannot agree. Some ancient sources claim tens of thousands of scrolls were lost in the blaze. Others suggest the damage was partial, not total. And yet, the very idea that centuries of knowledge vanished in a single night of fire is almost too tragic to comprehend. Imagine it, scrolls on ancient medicine, destroyed before they could heal, star charts reduced to ash, theories of the cosmos, of biology, of philosophy, each one erased in the blink of a flame. And yet the fire was not just physical. In the years that followed, the library faced more than smoke. Political instability, regime changes, and shifting priorities slowly chipped away at its support. Funding dwindled, scholars moved on. The guardians of the world's wisdom began to thin. But even in the face of loss, the library endured, if not in walls, then in spirit. Some scrolls survived, some scholars remained. The dream still flickered. Destruction, after all, is never just one moment. It is a long, slow unravelling. And in Alexandria, the fire may have started with Caesar's torches, but it would take centuries to finish what that first spark began. Still, within the ashes, something ancient lingered. The belief that knowledge, once lit, can never be fully extinguished. Though the fire in Caesar's time may have damaged the Library of Alexandria, the dream it embodied did not vanish overnight. Alexandria remained a city of scholars, and the thirst for knowledge endured. Out of necessity and hope, a second library rose, one not as grand as the original, but still sacred. This new library found its home in the Serapeum, a magnificent temple dedicated to Serapis, a Greco-Egyptian god of wisdom, healing, and light. The Serapeum stood on a hill above the city, crowned with statues, columns, and quiet courtyards. Here, within the temple's cool stone chambers, thousands of scrolls were housed, copies perhaps of those once held in the great library, or new works added by later generations of thinkers. The Serapeum became a continuation of the original vision. It preserved the texts that remained and provided a place for scholars to read, teach, and imagine. It was, in essence, the library's second life. But the world outside was changing. Alexandria, once the jewel of Egypt, found itself drawn deeper into the Roman Empire. Emperors came and went. Interests shifted. Science gave way to politics. The city's resources were stretched, and public support for scholarly pursuits slowly waned. And yet, the second library endured. Even as the original Mausion fell silent, students still gathered under the marble archways of the Serapeum. They read by lamplight, debated under olive trees, and shared ideas that echoed faintly from the golden age of the past. But this fragile continuation was not to last forever. By the 4th century CE, a new force had begun to reshape the ancient world: the rise of Christianity. The once pagan temples, including the Serapeum, became targets in a sweeping movement to redefine spiritual and cultural authority. In 391 CE, under the orders of Emperor Theodosius I, the Serapeum was attacked and destroyed. Whether scrolls still remained there at that time is unknown. Some say they had already been moved, others believe they perished with the building. All that is certain is this: another chapter of Alexandria's legacy closed in smoke and silence. But even in ruin, the idea lived on, because dreams like these, once shared across generations, do not end with fire. They linger, waiting to be reborn. As the centuries turned, Alexandria stood at the crossroads of shifting empires and rising faiths. The ancient city, once crowned by marble columns and golden light, slowly changed under the weight of new beliefs, new rulers, and new identities. The Roman Empire had grown vast and unstable. Its focus drifted from Alexandria to Rome, and eventually to Constantinople. The old institutions of learning, once nourished by royal support, were left to fade. The once vibrant Mausion had become quiet, its gardens overgrown, its scrolls scattered or neglected, and while the library's physical walls crumbled, so too did the world around it. By the 4th century, the Roman Empire embraced Christianity, first with tolerance and then with dominance. What had once been a sprawling tapestry of gods and philosophies became a single path, guided by church doctrine. Pagan temples, once respected as centers of wisdom, were rebranded as symbols of heresy and superstition. In this climate, the library's fate grew darker. In 391 CE, Emperor Theodosius I issued a decree. All pagan temples were to be closed. In Alexandria, this edict turned into violence. Christian mobs, led by the bishop Theophilus, descended upon the Serapeum. The temple was stormed, statues shattered, and what remained of the second library, if anything still survived, was likely lost in the chaos. Some accounts speak of scrolls burned in the streets. Others claim the library's contents had already vanished, long before the destruction. Truth and legend blur here, as they often do when fire and faith collide. What is certain is that the torch of knowledge, once so carefully guarded, was now a flicker in the wind. But this was not simply the end of books, it was the end of an era. The ancient world, with its philosophers and polytheistic shrines, gave way to a new world, guided by singular truths, sacred texts, and spiritual leaders. The nature of knowledge changed. Curiosity became dangerous in some circles. Questions gave way to answers that could not be challenged. Alexandria remained, but it was no longer the lighthouse of learning it had once been. Still, somewhere beneath the dust and silence, the echoes of old voices lingered, waiting, not for resurrection, but for remembrance. As the final embers of Alexandria's intellectual flame dimmed, one last brilliant light flickered in the city's shadowed streets. Her name was Hypatia. Born around 360 CE, Hypatia was the daughter of Theon, a respected mathematician and astronomer. From a young age, she was immersed in the world of numbers, stars, and ancient philosophy. But her brilliance quickly surpassed her father's. She became a scholar of mathematics, a teacher of Neoplatonic philosophy, and an expert in astronomy, at a time when women were rarely seen, let alone heard, in such realms. She wore the robes of a philosopher, not out of vanity, but conviction. She walked freely through Alexandria, teaching openly, drawing students of many faiths and backgrounds. To many, she was more than a teacher. She was a symbol, a voice of reason, calm amid the growing storms of religious and political unrest. But the world around Hypatia was changing, and not kindly. Christianity had become the dominant force in Alexandria, and with it came rising tensions between sects, ideologies, and rival leaders. In the early 400s, the Bishop Cyril of Alexandria rose to power, and conflict erupted between his supporters and those of the Roman governor Orestes, a pagan sympathizer and ally of Hypatia. Though Hypatia was not political, she was respected by both sides. That, perhaps, was her danger. In times of fear and power struggles, wisdom is not always welcomed. Her influence, her independence, and her unshakable dedication to reason made her a target. In 415 CE, Hypatia was attacked by a violent mob, believed to be fanatics aligned with the Christian faction. She was dragged from her chariot, brutally murdered, and her body burned in the streets. The details are grim. The message was clear. With her death, the final page of Alexandria's golden era was turned. She was not merely a scholar lost. She was the symbol of what had once been, of a city where minds had been free, of a time when questions were sacred and learning was an act of hope. Hypatia's name survives where many others have faded, not because she fought wars or built monuments, but because she dared to think and paid the ultimate price for refusing to stop. When we speak of the Library of Alexandria, we often speak of fire, the flames that may have consumed shelves upon shelves of scrolls, the ashes of knowledge drifting silently into the sea breeze. But the true loss is harder to measure. It is not just about what burned, but what never reached us. What was truly lost, no one can say for sure. The library's contents were never fully catalogued. It existed before the age of printing, when every book was copied by hand, each scroll a fragile bridge between generations. Some believe we lost the final plays of Sophocles, or early Buddhist texts translated into Greek. Others say ancient treatises on medicine, astronomy, chemistry, and mathematics disappeared, works from Babylon, Egypt, Persia, and India, carefully collected over centuries. There may have been maps drawn long before any modern explorer set sail, theories of atoms, observations of stars and comets, instructions for surgical procedures now reinvented in modern medicine. Some even believe the scrolls held knowledge of inventions, early machines, hydraulics, perhaps even glimpses of electricity or optics, long before they would resurface again in distant centuries. But more than the documents, it was the moment that was lost. For one of the first times in human history, people from many cultures had gathered in one place not to conquer, but to understand. Babylonian astronomers shared ideas with Greek philosophers. Egyptian priests debated logic with Indian mathematicians. The library was not just a collection, it was a connection, and when it fell, that thread unraveled. The loss of the Library of Alexandria was not just a tragedy of paper and ink, it was a pause in our progress, a fracture in the continuity of knowledge. Humanity had to rebuild slowly, painfully, across generations. Ideas once discussed freely in Alexandria had to be rediscovered hundreds, even thousands of years later. We do not mourn the library only for what it held. We mourn it for what it represented, a time when curiosity was sacred and learning was limitless, a time when the brightest minds could gather in peace, with nothing to fear but forgetting. And though the scrolls are gone, the silence they left behind still asks a question. What might we have become if the flame had never gone out? Though the Library of Alexandria may be gone, its scrolls turned to dust, its columns lost to time, the light it carried never truly died. It flickered, dimmed, nearly vanished, but it survived. In every age since, there have been sparks, small moments when the human spirit remembered that knowledge is sacred, that ideas are worth preserving, and that truth often whispers long before it shouts. The dream of Alexandria lived on in the great libraries of Baghdad, Cordoba, and Constantinople. It lived on in monasteries that preserved ancient texts through the dark winters of Europe. It lived on in the ink-stained fingers of translators who carried lost works from Arabic back into Latin, and in the early universities where minds were once again allowed to wander. And now, in the modern age, that same dream lives in our hands. It lives in the pages of books, in the quiet hum of servers storing centuries of thought, in the soft glow of a screen as a child reads their first poem, or as a scientist uncovers the secrets of stars. What Alexandria began was not just the gathering of knowledge, but the belief that knowledge belongs to all. That truth should not be hidden behind gates or guarded by power, but offered freely, like a flame passed from hand to hand, lighting the way. We can never recover what was lost in those ancient halls, but we can honor it. Every time we learn something new, every time we teach, every time we question, explore, or create, we become part of the same story. A story that began in stone and scrolls, in shadowed rooms and whispering courtyards, where humanity first dared to look beyond what was known and dreamed of what could be. The Library of Alexandria was not just a place, it was a promise that even in a world of fire and forgetting, there will always be those who carry the light, quietly, patiently, together. So as the night deepens and the world falls silent, know this: somewhere, in the turning of pages or the stillness of thought, Alexandria still breathes, and its light still burns in you. In the early morning of May 24th, 1819, a child was born in Kensington Palace. She was small, delicate, and unremarkable in the eyes of the court. Her name was Alexandrina Victoria, a name chosen to honor her godfather, Tsar Alexander I of Russia. Few expected this child to become queen. At the time of her birth, she was fifth in line to the throne, distant from power and seemingly destined for a quiet life on the fringes of royalty. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. Victoria's father, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, died of pneumonia just months after her birth. Her mother, Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, was left alone, grieving and cautious. Determined to protect her daughter and secure her place in the line of succession, she raised Victoria under strict supervision. This upbringing became known as the Kensington system, a rigid set of rules designed to keep the young princess under constant watch. She was not allowed to be alone, even for a moment. She couldn't walk downstairs without holding someone's hand. Her friendships were controlled. Her education was tightly monitored. Victoria's world was narrow, but her mind was wide awake. She found solace in books and diaries, where she began to record her thoughts with remarkable clarity. Even as a child, her writing showed glimpses of the strong will that would define her reign. She was observant, emotional, and fiercely independent beneath the surface. Her isolation made her observant. Her restrictions made her resilient. As time passed, a series of unexpected deaths among her relatives brought Victoria closer to the throne. By the time she was a teenager, she was the heir presumptive to the British crown. She understood what this meant, and what it would cost her. At age 11, she reportedly looked at a family tree and realized her destiny. "I will be good," she said simply. That promise, whispered in a child's voice, would echo through one of the longest and most transformative reigns in British history. She had been born in a palace, raised behind walls. But history was waiting beyond them, and the quiet girl with the serious eyes was about to step into the light. On a grey June morning in 1837, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain arrived at Kensington Palace. The old king, William IV, had died during the night. His niece, Princess Victoria, had just turned 18, old enough to rule in her own right. When the men informed her of the news, she stood quietly and said, with composure far beyond her years, "I will do my utmost to be worthy of my people." It was the beginning of a new chapter, not only for her, but for an entire empire. Victoria's first moments as queen were marked by quiet strength. One of her first acts was to request that she move out of her mother's apartments and into her own chambers at Buckingham Palace. It was a subtle act, but a firm one. For the first time in her life, she was alone and free. Though she was now sovereign, she lacked experience. She leaned heavily on Lord Melbourne, the Prime Minister, and a kind, fatherly figure. His guidance gave her confidence, and some accused him of having too much influence over the young queen. But he was patient, respectful, and attentive, a steady voice in a world of uncertainty. Still, her reign began with missteps. She made enemies by interfering in court appointments, especially among the Tories, and she was criticised for being too attached to her favourites. A scandal involving her lady-in-waiting caused a political stir, and she was forced to learn quickly how treacherous court life could be. Yet despite these early storms, Victoria took her duties seriously. She read every document presented to her, insisted on knowing the details of government affairs, and attended meetings with ministers. She believed deeply in the responsibility of her role. But there was no denying the loneliness. She was surrounded by advisors, courtiers, and attendants, but few friends. Her mother remained distant, her court full of protocol, and every step she took was watched and weighed. Victoria was a queen now, but she was still a young woman, newly thrust into the harsh light of power. In the quiet halls of her palace, she ruled alone, and waited for someone to stand beside her, not as a subject, but as a partner. In October of 1839, a young man arrived at Buckingham Palace. He was Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, Victoria's cousin from Germany. She had met him once before, but now, at 20 years old and newly secure in her role as queen, she saw him differently. When they met again, it was as if something shifted inside her. That very day, Victoria wrote in her diary, "It was with some emotion that I beheld Albert. He is so handsome, so delightful." Only 5 days later, she proposed to him. As queen, it was her privilege to ask. He could not. They were married on February 10th, 1840, in a simple ceremony at St. James's Palace. Victoria wore white, a tradition she helped to start, and a wreath of orange blossoms. As they exchanged vows, rain tapped gently against the windows, and outside, crowds gathered in celebration. Their marriage began as a deep and joyful love. Victoria adored Albert. She called him her angel, her dearest treasure. He, in turn, became not just her husband, but her closest advisor. With his keen mind and quiet discipline, Albert brought order and structure to Victoria's often fiery and impulsive nature. They were opposites. She was passionate, emotional, and headstrong. He was reserved, analytical, and methodical. But together, they created a powerful partnership. Albert immersed himself in the work of the crown. Though he held no official title beyond Prince Consort, he influenced nearly every aspect of royal life. He helped modernize the monarchy, advised ministers, and promoted science, education, and technology. His fingerprints were on everything from palace reform to the Great Exhibition of 1851. They had 9 children, and Victoria found joy in motherhood, though not without difficulty. She struggled with postpartum depression and often felt torn between public duty and private life. Still, her love for Albert was unwavering. When he was away, she wrote him letter after letter. When he returned, she greeted him with tears of joy. He was her son, her guide, her balance, her anchor. But life, even for queens, does not grant forever. The love story that had brought her such strength would one day leave a shadow so deep it would change her reign and her heart forever. In the winter of 1861, Prince Albert fell ill. At first, it seemed like exhaustion. He had been overworked, anxious over the scandal involving their son Bertie, and burdened by years of responsibility. But his condition worsened quickly. Fever set in. Doctors were uncertain. Some believed it was typhoid fever, others suspected a deeper, long-standing illness. On December 14th, at just 42 years old, Prince Albert died in Windsor Castle. Victoria was shattered. Her world, once filled with letters, laughter, and shared rule, suddenly fell silent. She locked herself away in grief, wearing black mourning clothes the very next day. She would wear them for the rest of her life. For more than a decade, Victoria rarely appeared in public. She refused to enter Buckingham Palace, preferring the quieter retreats of Balmoral in Scotland and Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. Parliament grew impatient. Newspapers criticised her absence. Some questioned her fitness to rule. But though she withdrew from sight, she did not abandon her responsibilities. From her secluded rooms, Victoria continued to govern. She read state papers, corresponded with ministers, and signed every official document. Her mourning was deep, but it did not break her sense of duty. Her grief became legendary. She surrounded herself with Albert's belongings. His clothes were laid out each day. His shaving water was delivered each morning, as if he might return. She kept his rooms untouched, his image in paintings and photographs everywhere. She wrote of him constantly in her diary, referring to him as her beloved and her precious angel. Every achievement, every sorrow, was filtered through the loss of the man she called her soul. To her children, it was both touching and suffocating. They lived in the long shadow of a ghost. And yet, in her mourning, Victoria created something enduring. She shaped the very image of the grieving widow, a queen wrapped in black, enduring sorrow with dignity. Her grief became part of her reign, part of her identity. Victoria ruled alone for 40 more years, but never again would she smile as she once had. The heart of an empire beat on, but deep inside, a quiet chamber of sorrow remained sealed and sacred. While Queen Victoria mourned in black, the British Empire surged forward into its greatest age of expansion. The sun, as people proudly claimed, never set on Victoria's empire. By the late 1800s, Britain held colonies and territories across every continent, from the hills of Canada to the coasts of Australia, the mountains of Africa, the Caribbean, and the jewel of the empire, India. Victoria watched this expansion from a distance. She was not a military strategist, nor did she send armies into battle, but she became the living symbol of the empire, a grandmother to distant nations, a sovereign figurehead on every colonial coin and official seal. In 1876, under the urging of Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, Victoria accepted a new title, Empress of India. It was ceremonial, but it carried great weight. Though she never visited India, she felt a deep connection to it. She read about its cultures, studied its languages, and even hired Indian servants to work in her household, most notably Abdul Karim, who became her friend and confidant in later years. To many in Britain, the title confirmed her global prestige. But to those living under colonial rule, the crown often represented something different: control, extraction, and the loss of autonomy. While some admired her, others resented her presence, distant, unasked for, yet all-powerful in name. Victoria herself had complicated views. She disliked racial prejudice and often defended her Indian subjects against the arrogance of her own court. But she also believed in the British mission to civilize and modernize its colonies, a belief common among her time, but steeped in empire's blind certainty. The empire brought great wealth and innovation to Britain: railways, telegraphs, new resources, but at a cost paid by millions across the globe. Victoria, wrapped in mourning clothes, reigned over this vast web of dominion. Her face appeared on stamps that travelled oceans, on coins exchanged in desert markets and mountain towns. She was distant, but everywhere. She had become more than a monarch. She was an idea of stability, tradition, and imperial order. And though she rarely left Britain again, her presence was felt in lands she would never see, her reign stretching across both borders and time. Though Queen Victoria ruled over a vast empire, her private world was ruled by something far more unpredictable: family. She and Prince Albert had 9 children, and through careful matchmaking, many of them married into the royal families of Europe. It earned her the nickname, the Grandmother of Europe. Her descendants sat on the thrones of Germany, Russia, Norway, Sweden, Romania, and Spain. Through blood and marriage, Victoria had woven her family into the very fabric of the continent. But royal blood did not guarantee royal harmony. Victoria had high expectations for her children, and she seldom hesitated to voice them. She meddled in their marriages, criticized their personalities, and struggled to let them live independent lives. Her letters, though loving, were often laced with disappointment or demands. Her eldest daughter, Victoria, Vicky, married the future Emperor of Germany. She was intelligent and idealistic, much like her father. But Victoria found her too liberal and too far away. Her son Bertie, the Prince of Wales and heir to the throne, caused her endless worry. He was social, flirtatious, and uninterested in scholarly matters. She often compared him unfavourably to Albert and doubted his ability to rule. Their relationship was strained for decades. Other children, like Alice, Alfred, Leopold, and Beatrice, each had their share of tragedy and challenge. Illnesses, early deaths, and political tensions haunted the family. Her son Leopold suffered from haemophilia, and her daughter Alice's children carried the gene into other royal houses, including Russia, where it would later haunt the doomed Romanovs. Victoria's love was deep, but her grip was tight. She could not bear to be parted from those she loved, even as they grew into adults with their own lives and countries. Her descendants brought glory and connection, but also division. The very web she had spun across Europe would one day become a trap, as the grandchildren she adored led nations into World War I, fighting each other from opposite sides. In the halls of Windsor and Balmoral, family portraits lined the walls, smiling, united. But beneath the gold frames and royal titles lay quiet resentments, fragile alliances, and the unspoken truth that even queens cannot command the hearts of those they raise. After Prince Albert's death, Queen Victoria withdrew from the grand courts and glittering ceremonies of London. In her sorrow, she sought comfort in quiet places, and found it unexpectedly in the rugged highlands of Scotland. There, at Balmoral Castle, the landscape offered something her palaces could not: solitude, fresh air, and honest company. And among the staff, one man stood out. His name was John Brown. A Scottish servant with a rough manner, plain speech, and unwavering loyalty, John Brown quickly became more than a member of the household. He became Victoria's constant companion, walking beside her, managing her horses, and guarding her privacy with fierce devotion. She trusted him, confided in him, laughed with him. He called her simply woman or woman, something no one else dared to do. She, in turn, called him my best, truest friend. To those within the royal household, he was a fixture, unofficial, but ever present. He stood close during walks. He accompanied her on rides. He even had a room near hers at Balmoral. Their closeness sparked rumours. Whispers of romance and even secret marriage rippled through the court. Some courtiers bristled. Her family grew uneasy. But Victoria refused to distance herself. Whatever the truth of their relationship, Brown gave her something no one else could: companionship without ceremony, affection without judgment. She felt safe with him. When Brown died suddenly in 1883, Victoria was devastated once again. She commissioned statues in his honour, kept his portrait near, and wrote pages in her diary mourning his loss. She even had a memorial stone placed over his grave with a personal inscription, a rare gesture for a monarch toward a servant. John Brown was not a prince. He had no title. But in the long, lonely decades of Victoria's widowhood, he had filled a space no one else dared enter. And though he left no crown, his presence lingered in the wind-swept paths of Balmoral, in the Queen's softened gaze, and in the hush that followed every quiet memory of the man who had once dared to walk beside her. Not as a subject, but as a friend. In 1897, Queen Victoria reached a milestone that few monarchs had ever seen: 60 years on the throne. It was a time of reflection, of celebration, and of grandeur. She was now the longest reigning monarch in British history, and the empire she symbolised had never been more vast. The Diamond Jubilee was planned not as a quiet occasion, but as a global event, one that showcased the immense reach of the British Empire. From every corner of the globe, dignitaries, soldiers, and colonial leaders travelled to London. Flags flew from rooftops. Streets were draped in colour. Bells rang across the kingdom. Victoria, by now in her late 70s, was frail and almost entirely wheelchair-bound. Her eyesight had faded, and she no longer walked unaided, but she still carried a quiet majesty. When she appeared in her carriage, wearing black with silver and white accents, crowds erupted into cheers. Her people saw not just a queen, but an era made flesh. On June 22nd, the official day of celebration, a grand procession made its way through London. Troops from India marched in vibrant uniforms. Representatives from Australia, Canada, South Africa, and beyond followed behind. The streets were packed with admirers, commoners and nobility alike, gathered not only to see the Queen, but to feel part of something larger. As her carriage moved past St. Paul's Cathedral, she chose not to climb its steps. Instead, a short Thanksgiving service was held outside, beneath the sky, surrounded by her people. She listened quietly, hands folded, eyes cast down. The weight of decades, of triumph and sorrow, sat gently on her shoulders. It was more than a royal event. It was a national moment of unity, a final golden chapter in the long novel of her reign. Victoria had outlived her husband, many of her friends, and even some of her own children. She had reigned through war and invention, political upheaval and industrial transformation. And now, she sat at the centre of an empire unlike any the world had ever seen. The girl who once wept behind Kensington's walls had become the matriarch of a global realm. And for one shining day, the whole world seemed to pause and say, "Thank you." By the turn of the century, Queen Victoria had become more than a monarch. She was a symbol of duty, resilience, and continuity. Generations had grown up knowing no other ruler. Her silhouette, her sorrow, her steadfast presence had defined an age. But even queens must yield to time. In the winter of 1901, while staying at her beloved Osborne house on the Isle of Wight, Victoria's health began to fail. Her eyesight dimmed further. Her strength waned. The once unshakable queen, who had ruled for 6 decades, now needed help simply to sit upright. Her children and grandchildren gathered around her bedside, knowing the end was near. On January 22, 1901, as twilight fell across the empire she had reigned for so long, Queen Victoria passed away. She was 81 years old. The world mourned. Bells tolled in London, and black crape draped windows across continents. In India, Africa, Australia, and Canada, flags were lowered. Leaders across Europe sent tributes, not just as statesmen, but as her descendants. She had truly been the grandmother of Europe, and her family now ruled in palaces from Berlin to St. Petersburg. Her funeral was unlike any other. In accordance with her wishes, it was not dark and heavy. She had asked not to be buried in black, but in white, with her wedding veil placed over her face. She was laid to rest beside Prince Albert, reuniting the love story that had shaped her soul. With her death, the Victorian era came to a close. She had ruled through revolutions, wars, and the birth of the modern age. Under her reign, Britain had transformed from a land of gas lamps and horse-drawn carriages into one of telegraphs, steam engines, and electricity. She had seen her nation grow into a world power, and yet had remained rooted in tradition. Victoria was not always adored. She was stubborn, commanding, and deeply human, but her devotion to her country never wavered. She reigned longer than any before her, and when she finally closed her eyes, a chapter in history ended, not with fanfare, but with the soft silence of a queen who had given her entire life to a crown and a people. There was a time when Egyptian hieroglyphs were not a mystery, when priests and scribes wrote prayers and laws across stone walls, and every curve of a bird, every mark of a reed, held meaning. The temples of Karnak, the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, these were not silent ruins. They were once filled with stories, names, and divine poetry, etched in a language meant for gods and kings. But time, as it often does, closed the book. As centuries passed, the old knowledge faded. Egypt was conquered by Persians, then by Greeks, and later by the Romans. Each new ruler brought new tongues, new traditions. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 CE, long after most had already forgotten how to read it. And then, nothing. The scribes died. The priests vanished. The keys to understanding were lost. For over 1,400 years, no one could read the writings on Egypt's ancient walls. The meaning of the hieroglyphs slipped into silence. Scholars admired their elegance, their mystery, but guessed wildly at their meaning. Some thought they were purely symbolic, mystic images with no relation to language. Others believed they were magical charms. No one could read the stories carved into the very bones of Egypt. The tomb of Tutankhamun, the mighty reign of Ramses, the wisdom of scribes, the voices of mothers and priests, all of it, locked behind symbols no one could unlock. It was as if an entire civilization had spoken a final word, and then vanished behind stone. By the 18th century, ancient Egypt had become more myth than memory. Travelers explored ruins, sketched statues, and took fragments of monuments back to Europe. But their meanings remained hidden. People could only wonder who these kings were, what these temples once said, and what truths were buried under centuries of sand. Then, in the summer of 1799, something changed. In the dirt near a small Egyptian town, a piece of black stone was found. It was chipped and broken, but something about it felt different. It carried writing, not just in the mysterious hieroglyphs, but also in Greek. And suddenly, for the first time in over 1,000 years, there was hope. Hope that ancient Egypt might speak again. In 1798, a young and ambitious Napoleon Bonaparte set sail for Egypt. His goal was not only military, he sought to strike a blow at Britain's colonial influence, but also intellectual. Napoleon believed Egypt was more than a battlefield. It was the cradle of an ancient civilization, holding secrets that had been buried for centuries. So, alongside his army, he brought an unusual group: scientists, artists, engineers and scholars, over 150 of them. They were known as the savants, and they were tasked with documenting everything they could find about Egypt's past. It was one of the most remarkable scientific expeditions of the time. While soldiers marched through the deserts and Nile valleys, the savants sketched temples, monuments and ruins. They recorded plants and animals, mapped cities, and tried to understand the ancient world that surrounded them. They filled notebooks with careful observations and marveled at the scale of Egyptian architecture. Everywhere they looked, there were hieroglyphs, carved deeply into pillars, painted along tombs, and etched onto statues. But no one could read them. The language remained closed, beautiful but impenetrable. The savants copied inscriptions and hoped that someday someone would find a way in. The expedition was both a success and a failure. Napoleon's military campaigns struggled against resistance from the British and the Ottomans. But in terms of discovery, it was extraordinary. It sparked a wave of fascination with ancient Egypt across Europe, a movement that would later be called Egyptomania. The scholars eventually published their findings in a monumental work called Description de l'Égypte, a series of volumes filled with drawings, maps, and writings about Egypt's history and culture. But even in those pages, the hieroglyphs remained silent. Then, in 1799, near a sleepy town called Rosetta, something unexpected happened. French soldiers, working on a fort along the Nile Delta, unearthed a heavy black slab. It was inscribed with 3 sets of writing: Greek, Demotic, and Egyptian hieroglyphs. The moment the scholars saw it, they knew it was different. This was not a ruin or a statue. This was a message, written in multiple languages. And if the Greek could be read, then perhaps, for the first time in centuries, the language of the pharaohs could be read too. It was July 1799. In the dusty heat of Egypt's Nile Delta, French soldiers worked under the sun, rebuilding the old Fort Julien near the town of Rosetta, a sleepy, palm-lined settlement not far from the Mediterranean coast. As they dug the foundations of the fort, one of the men struck something hard beneath the earth. At first, they thought it was just another slab of stone. Egypt, after all, was filled with ruins. But this stone was different. It was smooth, dark, heavy, and it was carved, not with 1 script, but 3. The man in charge, a French officer named Pierre-François Bouchard, immediately recognized its potential. He cleaned the stone and saw at the top a line of intricate hieroglyphs. In the middle, a flowing script known as Demotic, and at the bottom, clearly and legibly, Greek. It was damaged, the top corner missing, but enough remained to see the importance. Bouchard knew that Greek could be read, and if the message was the same across all 3 scripts, then this stone could be a bridge, a connection between the known and the forgotten. The Rosetta Stone, as it would later be called, measured about 3 feet 9 inches tall, made from a dark granitic rock known as granodiorite. It weighed nearly 1,700 pounds. But its true weight wasn't physical. It carried the weight of a lost language, and possibly the key to unlock it. Bouchard had the stone transported to Cairo, where the French scholars crowded around it in awe. They quickly copied the Greek text and began working on translations. It was clear that this was no myth or religious chant. It was a royal decree issued during the reign of Ptolemy V, a boy king who ruled Egypt over 2,000 years earlier. For the first time, scholars had a piece of ancient Egyptian writing that came with a translation. The stone was cracked, incomplete, but it was real, and it was enough. The message it carried had waited silently beneath the earth for centuries. Not in gold, not in glory, but in language. And now, for the first time in 1,400 years, ancient Egypt was ready to speak again. Once the Greek text on the Rosetta Stone was carefully transcribed, the message began to take shape. It was not a myth or poem, but a formal government decree issued in 196 BCE during the reign of Ptolemy V Epiphanes, a young king of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The decree praised the king for his generosity to the temples and his efforts to bring peace and prosperity to Egypt. It declared that a statue of the king should be placed in every temple and that priests should honor him with feasts and ceremonies. It was a standard royal proclamation, meant to display power and loyalty across the kingdom. What made it extraordinary wasn't the content, it was the language. The decree was written in 3 scripts, each used by a different segment of Egyptian society. Hieroglyphs at the top, used by the priesthood for religious and ceremonial inscriptions, sacred, ancient, and unreadable to modern eyes. Demotic in the middle, a simplified Egyptian script used for daily affairs, business, and administration, faster to write, but also forgotten over time. And Greek at the bottom, the language of the ruling elite, which scholars in the 18th century could still read fluently. This trilingual inscription was likely intended to make the decree accessible to everyone in Ptolemy's Egypt, from priests to scribes to rulers. But centuries later, it became something even more valuable, a linguistic bridge. By comparing the known Greek with the unknown hieroglyphs and Demotic, scholars believed they might finally unlock the ancient Egyptian script. It was the closest thing they had to a bilingual dictionary, etched in stone. But even with the Greek translation, the task would not be simple. Egyptian scripts were complex. Hieroglyphs, in particular, were filled with images. Birds, eyes, lions, reeds. Were they sounds? Were they symbols? Were they both? The Rosetta Stone offered a doorway, but not yet a key. Still, for the first time in over a millennium, there was real hope. Hope that the names of forgotten pharaohs, the rituals of ancient temples, and the stories carved into tomb walls might one day be heard again. Not in silence, but in their original voice. The Rosetta Stone had been discovered by the French, but in the chaos of empire, even discoveries can be claimed like territory. In 1801, just 2 years after the stone was unearthed, French forces in Egypt were defeated by a coalition of British and Ottoman troops. As part of the capitulation of Alexandria, the French were forced to hand over their scientific treasures, including artifacts, maps, drawings, and the Rosetta Stone itself. The French scholars protested bitterly. They had recognized the stone's importance. They had begun its study. But war had no patience for fairness. The stone was packed into a crate and placed aboard a British ship. It crossed the Mediterranean, passed through the Strait of Gibraltar, and arrived in London in early 1802. There, it was presented to King George III, and soon after placed in the British Museum, where it remains to this day. On its surface, a new inscription was added, captured in Egypt by the British Army in 1801. Though the Rosetta Stone had nothing to do with battle, it became a trophy, a symbol not just of discovery, but of imperial possession. Once in London, the stone drew crowds. Scholars and linguists flocked to see it. Plaster casts were made and distributed to universities across Europe. The race to decipher the hieroglyphs had truly begun. The British Museum became the new centre of Egyptological curiosity. But France was far from out of the picture. French scholars continued to study their copies of the stone, fiercely determined to solve the puzzle their country had brought to light. And so, what began as an accident on a dusty construction site in Egypt became a quiet contest between nations. Not of armies, but of intellect. The stone had passed from pharaoh to priest, from priest to sand, from soldier to scholar, and now stood beneath the soft lights of a museum, waiting, not to be admired, but to be understood. a fragment of forgotten time, now caught in the rivalry of modern empires, and still holding its secrets. Once the Rosetta Stone reached Europe, a wave of excitement spread through the scholarly world. For centuries, hieroglyphs had been silent, mysterious symbols that no one could read. Now, with Greek as a guide and Demotic as a stepping stone, there was a chance. But unlocking the ancient Egyptian language would take more than hope. It would take years of careful study, comparison, and imagination. The first real progress came not from a famous name, but from a Swedish diplomat named Johann David Åkerblad. In 1802, he began working with the Demotic section of the stone, an intermediate script that was simpler than hieroglyphs but still closely tied to ancient Egyptian. By comparing it with the Greek, he managed to identify several proper names, like Alexander and Ptolemy. It was a small but vital step. Others followed. Scholars across Europe attempted to decode the writing using the tools of classical languages. Some believed hieroglyphs were purely symbolic, images that stood for ideas rather than sounds. Others guessed they were a kind of ancient code that could only be cracked with the right philosophical insight. Progress was slow. Some tried to interpret the symbols with mystical theories, while others mapped letters one by one. It was like trying to solve a puzzle without knowing whether the pieces were pictures, letters, or riddles. But the idea that proper names could be a key became a central strategy. If scholars could recognize the cartouches, oval rings surrounding royal names, they could begin matching the symbols to Greek equivalents. And so, over time, a method began to form. Demotic helped bridge the gap between Greek and hieroglyphs. Scholars began to suspect that some hieroglyphs were phonetic, not just symbols, but sounds. Still, something was missing. A mind sharp enough to see the pattern, a scholar bold enough to break with tradition, and a heart patient enough to chase a vanished voice. That person had not yet arrived, but he was coming. And when he did, the last veil would lift from the Rosetta Stone, and the ancient language of Egypt would open its eyes once more. In the small town of Figeac, France, a boy named Jean-François Champollion grew up fascinated by ancient languages. By the time he was a teenager, he could read Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, and Coptic, the language descended from ancient Egyptian and used by early Christian Egyptians. But his obsession was singular: to understand the hieroglyphs. He studied the Rosetta Stone obsessively. With a copy in hand, he compared the Greek and Demotic texts, using his knowledge of Coptic to find connections. Coptic, he believed, held the key. It was the last breath of the ancient Egyptian language, frozen in time. For years, Champollion worked in silence. He pored over cartouches, those oval rings that surrounded royal names in hieroglyphs, and tried to match them with Greek equivalents like Ptolemy and Cleopatra. Each success confirmed what he had suspected. Hieroglyphs weren't just pictures, they represented sounds. In 1822, Champollion had his breakthrough. He discovered that many hieroglyphs were phonetic, representing syllables and letters much like our modern alphabets. This went against centuries of belief that hieroglyphs were purely symbolic or mystical. He showed that Egyptian writing was a complex system, part phonetic, part ideographic, and part determinative, using symbols to clarify meaning. With trembling hands, he wrote his findings. Then he rushed to his brother's office, burst through the door, and shouted, "Je tiens l'affaire! I've got it!" Then, overwhelmed by the moment, he fainted. Champollion's work didn't just open a door, it tore it off its hinges. For the first time in over 1,000 years, the hieroglyphs could be read. The voices of ancient Egypt, once locked in stone, began to speak. He would spend the rest of his life refining his system, translating inscriptions, and teaching others how to read the forgotten language. He even visited Egypt, standing at the foot of temples he could finally understand, not as ruins, but as living texts. He died young, at just 41. But he had done it. Through passion, study, and quiet persistence, Champollion gave Egypt its voice back. A language asleep for centuries, now whispered again through stone and scroll. And it all began with a single stone in the dirt. With Champollion's discovery, a world once silent began to speak. Temples that had stood in silence for centuries, Luxor, Karnak, Abu Simbel, were no longer mute. The walls of tombs, once admired for their beauty alone, now revealed the names of kings, the stories of gods, and the private hopes of everyday people. Hieroglyphs were no longer mysterious pictures. They were words. Scholars rushed to apply Champollion's system to inscriptions across Egypt. They translated texts from papyrus scrolls and sandstone walls, from coffins, statues, and obelisks. These were not just royal proclamations or lists of offerings. They were poems, hymns, contracts, medical instructions, and prayers for the afterlife. The Book of the Dead, once just a series of beautiful illustrations, now unfolded line by line, its spells guiding the soul through the underworld, offering protections, trials, and eternal judgment. Long-forgotten pharaohs like Thutmose, Akhenaten, and Ramses were no longer names alone. They became people again, leaders, builders, warriors, and dreamers. Hieroglyphs revealed everyday concerns as well. Scribbled notes between workers, jokes and graffiti in temple corridors, even letters written to the dead by grieving family members. These were not distant gods or alien beings. They were human voices reaching out across time. And what a language it was! Hieroglyphs combined beauty and function, each sign both a sound and a symbol. An owl might mean the letter M, but it also represented wisdom. A reed might mean I, but it also stood for growth. The writing was layered, poetic, and precise. Egypt was no longer a myth. It became a civilization that could speak for itself. And all of it had waited, hidden in plain sight, on statues, stelae, and temple ceilings, waiting for someone to listen. The discovery of how to read hieroglyphs didn't just change Egyptology. It changed our relationship with the past. Because now, when we gaze upon the walls of ancient tombs, we don't just see symbols, we hear stories. Not imagined, but real. And in every inscription, the pharaohs, priests, poets, and people of Egypt whisper softly once more. The Rosetta Stone rests today behind glass at the British Museum. Thousands of visitors pass by it each day, some pausing to read, others simply glancing at the dark slab of granodiorite, unaware of the weight it carries. It is not a jewel, nor a weapon, nor a statue of a king. It is a broken decree, written on a damaged stone, found by accident. And yet, it changed the way we understand the ancient world. Before its discovery, ancient Egypt was locked behind walls of silence. Its temples were admired, its statues worshipped, but its language, its soul, was lost. The Rosetta Stone didn't just provide a translation, it offered a bridge between worlds. Because of it, we can now read the wisdom of the pyramids. Because of it, the voices of the Nile speak once more. Its legacy lives in libraries, museums, and lecture halls. It lives in the work of archaeologists brushing sand from buried hieroglyphs. It lives in every child who gazes up at a pharaoh's carved name and knows, someone can read that now. But the Rosetta Stone also carries another lesson, that great discoveries often come from quiet places, that the keys to lost worlds are not always gold or glory, but language, and that sometimes understanding the past begins not with shouting, but with listening. The stone's journey, from the banks of the Nile to the halls of the British Museum, has sparked debate. Many believe it should be returned to Egypt, where its voice first emerged. Others argue it belongs to the world, a symbol of shared heritage. The conversation continues, but whatever its resting place, its meaning is beyond borders. It reminds us that no civilization is truly lost if its stories can still be read. The Rosetta Stone is more than an artifact. It is a reminder that patience, curiosity, and perseverance can revive the voices of the dead, rekindle the light of long-forgotten minds, and build bridges between centuries. And so, as the world sleeps, somewhere in the quiet halls of memory, Egypt still whispers, because the stone still speaks.